Welcome to the fourth part of an orientation and training program for Squadron sponsoring committees. This presentation focuses on the important task of developing a squadron budget that supports the training plan. It is geared for SSC members, including chairs and new treasurers, as well as squadron staff who might be interested in how a budget is developed and implemented. This presentation takes about 35 minutes. The OPC would like to extend our thanks to the British Columbia Provincial Committee for their original presentation on budget management. During this presentation, we will look at budget development process, as well as the ongoing budget management that the Squadron Sponsoring Committee does during the training year. This is not a technical presentation. It will only touch on the use of the ACC9 as it relates to budget building and budget management. During this presentation, we will utilize some simple case studies to illustrate various concepts and principles. These are real cases that have been dealt with by our squadron and regional directors during actual squadron visits. The Memorandum of Understanding, signed in 2020, clearly articulates the important role that the Air Cadet League plays in supporting the Air Cadet program. This is most evident at the local level. In broad terms, the Squadron Sponsoring Committee raises funds to purchase any resources not provided by the Canadian Armed Forces that are required to implement the local training program. This can include the rental of training facilities, training equipment, administrative resources, and transportation to various events, and so on. The new rescoped Air Cadet training program also recognizes that optional training activities are usually funded, in full or in part, by the Squadron Sponsoring Committee. The funds that are raised to support the local training program are managed on behalf of the cadets by the Squadron Sponsoring Committee. It is our job to ensure that all funds raised are used wisely and in the best interest of the squadron and the cadets. A budget is not a magical document. It is simply a plan on how we are going to raise funds and, more importantly, how we're going to spend the funds that we raise. It is not carved in stone, but it should be treated as an important guide so that the funds we raise are spent wisely. Having a well-developed budget is one way that we can demonstrate accountability to our stakeholders. Our budget, like all financial matters, should be open and transparent to all of our stakeholders. This includes the commanding officer, the squadron staff, the cadets, their parents, and our sponsors. Creating a squadron budget is a partnership between the Squadron Sponsoring Committee, representing the Air Cadet League, and the squadron staff, representing the Canadian Armed Forces. There are three key players: the chair, the treasurer, and the commanding officer. The commanding officer and the training officer develop the training plan, and this forms the basis of the budget. Other staff members also provide input into the training plan. The CO brings this information to the table, clearly identifying the estimated costs associated with the various training activities and squadron operations. The chair and the treasurer bring input from the Squadron Sponsoring Committee. This includes data from past budgets, fixed operating costs, and fundraising activities, such as a tag day. The projected expenses and the projected revenues are put together and then balanced. Once the budget is balanced, it is approved by the Squadron Sponsoring Committee and distributed. Then the treasurer assumes responsibility for monitoring it throughout the year. The process is not all that different from developing a budget for your home or your business. Let's take a more detailed look in how the budget is developed. The budget planning process starts as soon as the training program for the next year is approved by the area office. This usually happens in late May or early June. The chair and the treasurer should first start by looking at previous budgets. Fortunately, the financial document that we provide, the ACC9, has a useful tool called the Budget Tracker. This tab looks at the budget from the previous year and compares the amounts that were assigned to each budget line with the amounts spent during the training year. Looking at previous budgets gives you a sense of what your fixed costs are, as well as where you have allocated funds for cadet training. The ACC9 also provides a useful tool to develop a preliminary budget. The Budget Planner provides estimates for this year's budget based on the previous budget. This is only a draft. You can adjust any amount to reflect this year's priorities and needs. The second step of preparing your budget is to gather information. The commanding officer needs to look at the training plan and identify all activities that are going to be included, and then identify whether the activity is going to be locally funded out of the squadron budget or funded by the military. The CO also needs to look at the purchase of new training equipment, repair of current equipment, administrative requirements such as the cost to run the office and the supply section, and bring all of this information to the first budget planning meeting. The chair and the treasurer identify known expenses. These are called your fixed operating costs. Fixed operating costs are those that occur regardless of what is happening in the training program. Your previous budgets will help to identify these costs as well as provide an estimate for your current budget. Don't forget to build in some funds for administrative expenses, paper and pens, etc., for the supply section, as well as the repair or replacement of squadron-owned equipment. Now we look at the different revenue sources. Start with the local support allocation. These funds are provided to the squadron by the Canadian Armed Forces to reimburse the squadron for certain approved expenses. The amount of the LSA varies from year to year based on the size of the squadron and the size of the LSA grant that the region must allocate. The commanding officer is provided with the amount of the local support allocation each year. The chair, treasurer, and CO must work together to submit the necessary claim forms to the Canadian Armed Forces for reimbursement. Your past ACC9s are also useful here as they provide some historical perspective on how well your fundraising is done in prior years. It will tell you how much you can expect to bring in through tag days, from your sponsor, and other local supporters, like the Legions, as well as how much your previous fundraising campaigns, like selling chocolate bars, has brought in. If your unit asks the parents for a voluntary donation, don't forget to include these amounts in your revenue estimates. The budget equation is simple. Your income minus your expenses should never be less than zero. In other words, your budget should be balanced. Squadrons should not be running a deficit where your expenses are greater than income. This should always be our goal. Reality sometimes changes things, and we will talk about that later in this presentation. If the first trial budget is balanced, that is, income equals expenses, then you have achieved a balanced budget. Congratulations. That doesn't happen very often. Commanding officers often start with a lengthy wish list of activities that they would like to run and equipment that they would like to purchase. But they realize that it may not be possible to get everything. So, if the budget does not balance on the first attempt, it will be up to the CO to go back to the wish list and look at making some adjustments. Some activities might have to be put on hold for consideration later in the year. Some purchases may have to be postponed. There are several ways to reduce expenditures. The chair and the treasurer also must look at how they can reduce costs. Some administrative expenses might have to be deferred. But the chair and the treasurer also need to look at their sources of revenue and determine if the amounts they are projecting are realistic. Are there other sources of revenue in the community that should be explored? Can we ask our sponsor for more funds? Can we plan another fundraising activity, preferably one that does not directly involve the cadets? These are all tough decisions that the commanding officer, the chair, and the treasurer must make together. Over the course of 1 or 2 meetings, the key players will eventually produce a balanced budget. Once that happens, it is brought to the entire squadron sponsoring committee and voted on. This should happen in late August or early September. A copy of the final budget is provided to the commanding officer, who is then able to share it with the squadron staff. An approved budget means that routine expenses, like the purchase of admin supplies, can now be started. Training facilities for weekend events can now be booked by the squadron sponsoring committee, buses can be chartered, etc. Planning for fundraising activities can also start in earnest. Major expenses can now be considered, but care should be taken when looking at any major purchase. More on that later. Here is a case study that will clarify the importance of transparency regarding financial matters. Take a few seconds to read it over. Okay, now let's answer these questions. Does the commanding officer have the right to this information? Absolutely, as does any other staff member. Because the commanding officer is normally invited to the SSC meetings and a financial report should be part of the agenda, the CO should be up to date on the financial health of the squadron. The CO should also have a full copy of the approved budget. Does anyone else have a right to this information? Yes, other members of the staff can be advised, as well as members of the sponsors group or parents. We want to be open and transparent with all of our stakeholders. What format should the sponsoring committee use? Well, that's a local decision. Some treasurers simply give a report on how much money is on hand in the various squadron accounts, as well as any outstanding invoices or deposits. Some treasurers use the ACC9 and print off page 2 and 3, which lists the income and expenses for each category. The budget tracker in the ACC9 provides a much more in-depth look at the budget, and it is normally only reviewed every 3 or 4 months, or after each major fundraising project. Each SSC can structure the financial report in the best way to meet their group's needs. The treasurer plays a key role in monitoring and reporting on the financial health of the squadron. This usually happens during the monthly SSC meetings. It is normal for the treasurer to report on the state of the squadron bank accounts, listing any revenues or expenses that have happened since the last meeting. The treasurer also walks the entire SSC through a more in-depth budget review using the ACC9 budget tracker every 3 or 4 months. This can also happen following major fundraising campaigns such as tag days. During the fall, the treasurer is also busy closing off the previous year's ACC9 and getting it ready for submission to the OPC. The treasurer also works with the OPC office to submit the annual T3010 form to Revenue Canada. Here are some other budget practices to consider as you monitor your squadron budget. Once you have balanced and approved your budget, don't change the amounts for each line item. Keeping these initial amounts unchanged doesn't mean you can't spend more in a particular budget item than you originally planned. The difference will then be tracked and displayed in the budget tracker as a surplus or deficit, and this will help you in subsequent years when you do your preliminary budget plans. Even though a major expenditure such as computers, IT equipment, or major activities are included in the approved budget, it is important for the person authorizing the expenditure to check with the treasurer to confirm that the funds for that purchase are available and that making the purchase now will not cause problems down the road. It is not necessary to reapprove the expenditure, but the CO should check and confirm with the chair prior to authorizing anyone to go out and make that purchase. Any optional events that were not included in the original budget or training plan need to be approved by the SSC. This often happens throughout the year. The commanding officer is presented with an opportunity for the cadets to participate in an activity that was not included in the original training plan. The CO needs to estimate the costs and bring it to the SSC for a discussion and a vote. We'll talk about that in a case study. Remember, any fundraising activity that involves the cadets directly must be approved by the commanding officer and the area office. This includes things like tag days. Plan ahead. Make sure that you have the approval well in advance. Note, sending information home with cadets about an online fundraising campaign does not constitute direct involvement with the cadets. Direct involvement would occur if cadets were asked to take a product, like a box of chocolate bars, home and sell them to friends and neighbors. Here is another case study that looks at how squadrons might consider making a major expenditure. Take a moment to look it over. Because the purchase was included in the budget, enough money was set aside in the budget to cover the cost. But is there enough money in the squadron's general account to cover the purchase right now? Or do we have to wait until a major fundraiser is over to have enough money to pay for these items without jeopardizing the SSC's ability to cover other expenses? So the first thing the CO should do is check with the chair and treasurer to see if there's enough cash on hand to make the purchase. If there is, then the CO can go ahead and make that purchase. Because the purchase was already approved in the budget, it should not be necessary for the SSC to vote again. If money is tight, but the CO, chair, and treasurer all agree that this is a deal too good to pass up, the chair and the treasurer may decide, in consultation with the CO, to defer other purchases to a later date. Alternatively, the chair and treasurer might decide to dip into the squadron's reserve funds to cover the expense. We'll be talking about reserve funds later in this presentation. Here is another situation that often happens during the training year. Take a moment and review this case study. No matter how diligently the CO and the training officer plan the unit's training schedule, there are always opportunities that pop up at the last minute that everyone wants to participate in. If the activity was not included in the original budget, how can we make this happen? Let's figure it out. If this is a supported event, then the military will cover the cost to get the cadets to the event. However, in situations like this, the activity would more likely be considered optional, which means that the SSC has to cover the costs. So the question is, how does the SSC find the extra funds? Well, first you can look at other optional events that were already included in the training plan and approved in the budget but have not yet happened. Can you switch one that has already been approved for this new one? Can you use funds that were allocated for another expense, like admin costs, to cover this expense? Remember, don't change the budget allocation, but make note of the decision. Consultations about changes to the training program should be done with the CO and the training officer. Could the SSC organize another fundraising project, preferably one that does not require direct cadet involvement, because that requires approval from the military? Finally, if it's a really good opportunity for the cadets, the SSC could use some of its reserve funds to cover the added expense. In any event, because this expenditure was not part of the approved budget, it should be voted on and approved or not by the SSC. In recent years, charitable gaming in Ontario has become a popular source of funds for many squadron sponsoring committees. Charitable gaming in Ontario includes both break open or Nevada tickets and charity bingo. Many squadrons now use these as a major source of fundraising. They can be very profitable, don't require a lot of work, and most importantly, don't directly involve the cadets. Each municipality is responsible for issuing licenses for both activities, so you will have to check with them for specific procedures to be followed in your community. Typically, there is a license application process where the organization requesting the license, in this case the Squadron Sponsoring Committee, must identify who they are and what they are going to use the funds for. Some expenses, like overnight accommodations, administrative functions, assessment, and meals, are not allowed. Nevada tickets are usually sold at local convenience stores. Companies such as Bazaar Marketing, to name just one, often work as intermediaries between the licensee, that's the Squadron Sponsoring Committee, and the merchant. For charitable bingos, companies such as Delta Bingo and Gaming, again to name just one, operate commercial bingo establishments that support local community charities and organizations. The member charities and organizations provide volunteers or members of their organization to assist with running the bingo games. Both fundraising programs do require regular reports. Bingo reports are done monthly. Nevada ticket reports are done at the end of the license period. Check your municipal office for more details. The treasurer will also have to set up separate accounts for charitable gaming funds rather than have the revenue deposited in the squadron's general account. If your unit has both a Nevada account and a license for charity bingo, you will need an account for each. Funds raised through various fundraising activities, such as tag days, go into the squadron's general account. Funds raised by the sale of Nevada tickets goes into a separate Nevada ticket account, and funds raised through the local bingo hall would also go into its own separate account. Charitable gaming funds can only be spent on specific items that are approved by the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Commission and are identified in your license application. Most squadron sponsoring committees use these funds for the support of training activities provided by the squadron, the purchase, rental, and repair of training equipment, and so on. This can create some additional work during the budget planning process. Once the training plan has been approved and the CO has brought forward his or her wish list, it is important to go through each proposed expenditure and identify who is going to pay for it. For example, a specific training activity, such as an area-directed activity, would be paid for by the military. The purchase of band equipment might be allocated to charitable gaming funds if it was put on your license. The annual assessment to be paid to the OPC must be taken out of your squadron's general account. Funds raised throughout the year also need to be deposited into the proper account. The funds from most fundraising activities, such as tag days, would go into the squadron's general account. Funds raised by the sale of Nevada tickets would go into a Nevada account, and funds raised from the local bingo hall would also go into a designated bingo account. The treasurer, or someone on the SSC assigned to look after charitable gaming, will also have to prepare and submit reports. Check with your local municipality about the schedule for submitting these reports. If your unit is involved with charitable bingos, there is some online training that must be completed prior to your volunteers going in for their first shift. Your local bingo hall will provide you with more information. The pandemic is still fresh in our minds. We lost the ability to fundraise for a couple of years, but still had expenses that we had to cover. Units that had a healthy reserve fund were able to weather the pandemic storm, whereas units that had little or no reserve funds struggled to pay their bills. Reserve funds are normally used to cover major, significant events that change the fundraising landscape and make it more challenging to raise funds. In addition to events like the pandemic, changes to military policies or municipal rules and regulations can make dramatic changes in how we raise funds, especially with those fundraising activities that involve cadets. The League strongly encourages SSCs to build a reserve fund that is the equivalent of at least 1 year's operating expenses. This takes time, as most SSCs do not normally have bags of money just sitting around. Typically, units add extra money that they may have left over at the end of their training year to their reserve funds. Reserve funds are normally kept in two forms: cash on hand and safe investments. Cash on hand is the extra money that SSCs keep in their bank account. These are funds that we use at the beginning of the year before we've done any fundraising to get the training year started. This is the reserve that we dip into to help smooth out cash flow issues, pay for unplanned expenses like that replacement photocopier, or for events that were not originally planned in the budget. However, money sitting in a checking account typically does not earn any interest. So, rather than keep a large amount of money in a bank account, the SSC can also take a portion of that money and invest it in a safe, conservative investment, like a GIC or a savings bond. When selecting which investment to use, remember that you must first protect the principal amount invested, and second, you want to keep these funds accessible. It is important to remind everyone, including SSC members, the commanding officer, and staff, that the reserve funds are not a slush fund, something that should be spent. We are not like the military, where they receive funds from the government each year, and any funds left over at the end of their year are returned to the government. In our financial world, we need to build a cushion to help cover unexpected situations. GICs and savings bonds are two safe, stable investments that many SSCs use to hold some of their reserve funds. When investing a large amount, consider breaking it into several smaller amounts and setting the renewal dates for each bond or certificate so that you can access some of the funds, if necessary, without cashing in the entire amount. For example, instead of investing $10,000 in one GIC, you might consider investing it in 5 GICs worth $2,000 each, with each GIC maturing on a different date. Your bank can help set these up. Regardless of how much you have in your reserve funds, the decision to dip into the reserves is a serious one and should only be done after all other options have been considered. The decision to use reserve funds should be voted on by the SSC and a record of the vote included in the minutes. If you need help throughout the training year, either with your budget or with your ACC9, please contact the OPC office and ask for Jessie. She is our main contact for financial support and will be a great assist to you. You can also contact your assigned squadron director or regional director for support when dealing with financial matters involving the chair, the treasurer, and the commanding officer. Building a budget is not as complicated as it sounds. It takes some common sense, openness with all parties, and cooperation with the commanding officer, the chair, and the treasurer. All parties bring important information to the budget planning process. You can't build an accurate budget without all of the information from the SSC and from the commanding officer. Once the budget is approved, it forms the plan to guide spending throughout the training year. An effective SSC with an experienced chair and treasurer with good cooperation from the commanding officer will manage the squadron's budget effectively and efficiently. Remember, the funds that we are managing are funds held in trust for the cadets. We owe it to them to make sure we get the best bang for every buck.